Hey everybody, it's Dr. Cody Rawl with Techforpsych. Today I'm interviewing Dr. Olav Krigolson, a researcher at University of Victoria that's made huge strides in mobile EEG research with the Muse Headband. He's published a variety of articles in well-respected scientific journals using the Muse Headband. These are research projects in hospitals, with sports teams, in the mountains of the Himalayas, and with the NASA Mars Habitat Project research team. In addition, he's led the science in a groundbreaking new app called Aspire that measures attention and cognitive fatigue in clients and test subjects using evoked related potentials from the Muse Headband. Finally, we have types of quantitative EEG measures that are coming to us in the form of mobile apps thanks to people like Dr. Krigolson. Stay tuned for our conversation on his background, research projects, and the future of Aspire. If you haven't already, please hit subscribe to support Techforpsych. I really appreciate it. Let's dive into the content. All right, Dr. Cody Rawl here with Techforpsych. I'm here with Dr. Olav Krigolson. Such an honor to have you on, Olav.
Thank you for having me on.
Yeah, I've used your paper so many times on presentations, the Choosing Muse 2017 paper, because it helps so much just to have some scientific data behind talking about using the Muse. And you compared it to, I guess, what you would call like a gold standard device, right? That was the idea behind the paper, correct?
That's exactly what we did. So when we first got our hands on the Muse, and obviously the question you've heard is, a lot of people look at this headset that costs $250 and say, well, does this measure EEG the same way the hospital equipment would? So we put it head to head with our $100,000 research grade system. And as you can see in the paper, we basically got the exact same results with both.
And of course, you've done a lot of research with EEG and neuroscience in general. And I'd love you just to talk to the audience about your background and how you got into neuroscience and what your lab looks at University of Victoria.
Well, my story is a little bit different. I kind of stumbled into neuroscience. I was at Indiana University doing a master's degree, and I thought I was going to be a basketball coach. And I took an elective course in neuroscience because it was there was a little blurb about how people learn. And I thought, well, if I'm a teacher and a coach, this could be useful. And I just, what they say, I just got hooked. I just thought it was fascinating, and especially how much we don't know about the brain. So that led me to a PhD in neuroscience at the University of Victoria, and I did a postdoc at the University of British Columbia in medical neuroimaging, and I've been a neuroscience professor now for 9 years. So as you might guess, one of the primary areas of interest in my lab is learning. So we do the neuroscience of human learning. We also do the neuroscience of decision-making. So our two big areas that are learning and decision-making. But in the last sort of 5 or 6 years, we've got really interested in mobile technology, like the Muse. And that's opened up a whole bunch of doors. So we've done concussion assessment, fatigue assessment, just general brain health, cognitive impairment, you name it. So we're tackling a lot of different projects right now using mobile technology.
One of the themes that I love to explore on the channel is this idea of technology getting smaller, more portable and available, and democratizing that technology. And I was really curious to hear your perspective on what EEG and other brain imaging technology was like when you were first starting out, and how it's progressed and what it is now, and what opportunities that's opened up for you in your research.
Well, if you had told me in 2008 when I finished my PhD that you'd be able to measure brainwaves off of an iPhone with a headband, I would have told you that there's no way. So it's come a long way in just over a decade, right? When I started doing it, we were working with a system similar to the one I have now. So it's basically a large amplifier that takes, you put a bunch of electrodes on there on someone's head and you measure EEG, but it's expensive and time consuming. Putting on 64 electrodes on top of the head takes quite a bit of time. You need a proper, a research team in place. And what's happened, much like, if you think back to the first cell phones, the brick, these massive things that people were holding besides their heads. But the best example I give people when they ask about, can EEG really be done that way, is in my lab, we have a virtual reality headset that we bought 9 years ago for $45,000. Because that's what VR cost 9 years ago. And we just bought an HTC Vive Pro that has far better graphics for $1,000. So just like, virtual reality and cell phones have gotten smaller and better, EEG's gone that way too. So it's just amazing the array of headsets that are out there now, because there's the Muse, but there's Emotive, there's NeuroSky. There's a whole range of these headsets and different uses of that kind of technology.
Yeah, and I was curious how, you've
seem like you built up a good relationship with Interaxon and Muse. I watched a podcast that you did with Graham and Ariel talking about this technology. And I myself have found them very open to conversation about these type of things and working with researchers. Not that the other ones haven't, but for whatever reason, Muse just seems to be really accessible for researchers right now. Originally I thought you were in Toronto, but University of Victoria is not anywhere near. So I was curious, like how that relationship built up over time.
Well, it basically, it's thanks to our previous prime minister, so not the current one, but the one before, Stephen Harper. Basically what he did is he created a bunch of grant programs for researchers to partner with industry. And the idea was to make applied science. So take basic science and see what you can do in the real world. So I actually reached out to Interaxon, 5 or 6 years ago now and sort of said, look, we should get one of these grants and test your headset and see what it can do. And they were really open to that. Like you said, their chief science officer, Graham Moffat's a great guy. And him and I have been working together ever since, doing a bunch of projects. And they definitely, the Muse headset's wonderful. It measures high-grade EEG. And they definitely are very open to working with people.
And I just wanted the audience right now just to get a scope of all the things that you're doing with this mobile technology. Would you mind naming baseball, medicine, NASA, astronauts? There's such a range.
So yeah, the Muse has opened a lot of doors, that's for sure. The first project you mentioned is I have a former graduate student, Anthony Pluta, used to play Major League Baseball. And when he started his master's degree, he asked me a really simple question. He sort of said, well, with that little headset of yours, can you measure whether or not someone's in the zone? Because the zone is supposed to be this mythical mental state that when athletes are in it, they perform really well. So I said, AJ, I don't have a clue, but let's try that. So we basically recorded brainwave data from the Muse before people went up to bat, and we found that we were able to predict batting performance based on their brain activity before they bat, which was kind of cool when you think about it. So that was one project we did. We're doing a lot of work in cognitive fatigue. So it started in the medical environment where we were being asked to sort of see whether we could tell whether doctors and nurses how tired they were, and did they get more tired across a shift. So that actually led to a spin-off startup company that I'm a part of called Suva. So we took that fatigue technology and made Aspire, which is our app that stemmed from that. But to get back to the project, we're measuring EEG, and lo and behold, doctors and nurses in the ER get tired. That's no one's surprised. But what surprised us is that some of the doctors and nurses were exhausted when they started their shift. And we think we all know that that's true, but being able to come up with an objective way to measure that is kind of cool. And then that led us to NASA. We were doing all this cool work with portable EEG, and a question that was raised is on the Mars mission, they're going to be sending people out into space for 3 years. We know that cognitive fatigue will become an issue because of the stress of the environment. So we're going to deploy that technology in the next Mars habitat mission. So the astronauts will use the Aspire app and the Muse Headband, and we'll measure their brain waves every day and see if we can detect at the point in the mission where they're starting to get a little bit too tired, and then hopefully an intervention could be launched.
And that project's out in Hawaii, correct? They got the red rock.
Yeah, exactly. So the High Seas Habitat is run by a friend of mine, Dr. Kim Binstead, and she basically built the High Seas Habitat on the slopes of Mauna Leo volcano. And it's kind of cool because when you go there, it's actually in a red rock, volcanic rock field. So it actually looks like Mars, except off in the distance you can see the surf beaches and stuff. So it's not perfect. But yeah, the astronaut candidates go in for 3 months, 6 months, sometimes a year, and they're basically trying to figure out and solve all the human factor problems that are going to happen in that environment before they happen. So one good example I can share is that the way they used to do meals is you'd get like a prepackaged frozen meal and you would heat it up. And you could imagine somewhere in the habitat there'd just be a massive stack of these things, and you just pick out the one you want and fight over who got spaghetti and meatballs or whatever. But what they realize, it makes a lot more sense to put a kitchen in, and then the astronaut candidates have the freedom to make whatever they want. So you can take all the ingredients from 5 meals, and between those ingredients you can make 30 or 40 different things. So that was the kitchen study where they realized that having a kitchen is a good idea. So our little piece of that's going to be this fatigue assessment that we'll be doing to see if we can see when the astronauts get too tired to function. And you could imagine that someone's going to go out for a Mars walk and everyone does the assessment, and the person that was supposed to go might be too tired that day, so you send someone else.
Yeah, and I can imagine at one point the sensors would be incorporated into a helmet or something, right? Something like
yes.
that.
So the Muse is our current form factor, but that'll evolve over time. And you could imagine if NASA leaps into this, which is our hope, they'll build their own version of a headset that they build right into the whatever the astronauts are wearing.
Yeah, Graham showed us recently the soft band that goes around the head, and I can imagine that like be more applicable to like a helmet scenario, you know?
Exactly, and you never know what the future form factor will be. I've seen an EEG system that was in a Band-Aid. So it's essentially, so cool. It's just a little thing about this big, and you tape it on behind your ear, and it doesn't just have EEG sensors. It's got a whole whack of different sensors in it. And you know, I hate to get too futuristic, but at some point I suspect we'll all have a little chip behind our ear that's just measuring all this data all the time.
Definitely. You had a trip planned for Nepal. Did you go yet?
We haven't gone yet. We went back in 2016, but we're going back. We actually just recently got delayed a bit, so now we're going in May of 2020. But we'll be going to Nepal. The idea is to collect as much mindfulness data from as many Tibetan Buddhist monks as we can find. And there's two projects. One is we're very interested in the mindfulness data, and we want to go to the source and get the people that have been doing it their whole lives. But the other thing we're doing is we're very interested in the effects of altitude sickness. So this is with a colleague and close collaborator of mine, Dr. Gordon Binstead, where right now we know that people, when they get altitude sickness, make some poor decisions, and sometimes they die because of it. So we're hoping with mobile EEG we'll be able to detect something that indicates when someone's in that state, and hopefully that'll be a life-saving intervention.
Yeah, so many applications there. It's awesome, all the stuff that you're doing.
When I get together with my students in my lab and we just we get out the whiteboard and think of all the possible things we could do, it's we have too many good ideas right now, not enough time.
I'm sure. Well, I'm proud to say that I feel like my audience is pretty technical, so I wanted to get into sort of the nitty-gritty of these things that you're measuring and how the app actually does it. Maybe not reveal all your secrets, but it is published in quite a few of your papers, and it brings me back to even the 2017 paper that you published. There's two tests in there. There's the Stroop test, and then there's the gambling test. And it looks like you've incorporated those into the Suva Aspire app to actually measure the cognitive fatigue by measuring something called an Evoked Related Potentials. So I'd love for you to sort of dive into the nitty-gritty of like how that actually works.
Yeah, so most people know what continuous EEG is because they've seen it on a hospital show. So if you put some electrodes on the head, you're measuring the human electroencephalogram, or EEG, or what some people call brain waves. And really that's the net result of the neurons in your brain firing. So that's well and good. What we do is we focus in on a subset of that, which is in my lab and in the app, we have people play games, if you will. So one of the games we use is called Oddball. And basically you just see a series of circles. And most of the circles are one color, but some of the circles are a different color. And what we tell you is, say the blue circle is the target color. We say, okay, we want you to ignore the yellow circles, but every time you see a blue circle, touch the screen. Now, what happens when you do that is your brain responds every time you see those blue circles. Your brain's going, well, hey, that's important. I got to touch the screen. Now, that response, we can capture it in terms of an event or evoked potential. And so it's basically the brainwave response to an event. So what we do is we get you to play the game for 5 or 6 minutes, and then we look at all of those responses, and we just average them together, and you get an average brain response to the target circles. And that evokes something very specific that we call a P300. It sounds like a strange name, but it basically boils down to P is for positive, because it's a positive voltage deflection, and 300 is the timing, which is it comes in roughly at 300 milliseconds. And the P300 is well known. So it was first discovered in 1975 by Sam Sutton. So you're talking about something that has been around for a long time. There's thousands and thousands of papers on the P300. And in the case of the Aspire app, if you hunt through all those papers, you'll find that people have been talking for a while and saying that, hey, the P300 is smaller when you're tired. So cognitive fatigue reduces that amplitude. And that's essentially what we leverage in the Aspire app, is we get you to play the game, we measure these evoked potentials, we then compute this P300, and that's what we sort of essentially display is here's your P300 score. Now, we don't call it that within the app, but that is what we're measuring, and that's sensitive to cognitive fatigue, amongst other things.
Yeah, we were talking before, and it sounds like right now the app compares it to the person, but the idea is, eventually once you have enough data, you can start comparing it to population as well, right?
So we're already starting to do that. It's not in the version of the app that most people see. So right now, you're right. You measure yourself over time, and you see how those P300 scores change across, whenever you test yourself. So I know with mine, my scores are pretty good on a Monday typically, but by Friday they're down a bit because the week's worn me out. But Saturday and Sunday they trend up as I rest over the weekend, and it's the endless cycle we all go through. If I fly, I went to New Zealand over the Christmas holidays, and my scores, when I got after the 14.5-hour flight were rock bottom. But after a week of vacation, they go up, and we've got a lot of use cases. I've had athletes train, and if they go from a state of not training to training, their scores slowly rise, because we know that exercises is good for you. People have told me that they've done dietary manipulations. They've cut out fatty foods and reduced sugar, and low enough your brain function increases so your scores go up. And then of course the fatigue side is if you do the things that make you tired, guess what? Your scores go down. Now the other piece to that is we are building a population data set. So at Suva, it's our spin-off company, Suva Technologies. We have the largest population data set in the world of this type of data. And we're starting to get a feel for what a good P300 is. So the example I always use is right now, if I asked you what a good heart rate is, you'd say 50 or 60 beats a minute, good blood pressure, 120/80. Well, what's a good P300? Well, no one really knows, but we're starting to get a feel for that. So we're able, with the next version of the app, which isn't released yet, we're able to place you within the population and say, well, this is where your score is relative to everyone else.
Yeah. I've heard you talk about that before. It's like this idea of, the statistical analysis of papers in the past is because we didn't have enough people to test, and now it's like you have so much data, right?
Exactly. So the way that when you read academic papers and you see the little p-value, everyone gets excited, right? It's something statistically significant. You hear this all the time. Really, that's because what people do is they take a small subset of data, and then they're trying to draw a conclusion about a big group, like the population. So, if you look in, just the other day, I was saying I saw they surveyed 1,000 people, and they were drawing some claims about population feelings, about some issue, and they always give you their tolerance range. Well, in theory, if you tested enough people, if you tested everybody, you wouldn't do statistics. You would just know the exact percentage. So the larger and larger your data set gets, the more accurate you can say, well, this is where you fit into a particular place.
Right. I mean, so many implications here. So one of the other things that I wanted to talk about that you had mentioned that I found just really interesting is in that paper, you had the oddball paradigm, but also you had this gambling game too. And it's a little bit more difficult for me to understand like how that actually works.
Go ahead. I can walk you through that. So basically, there is, unlike the oddball task, which has a very well-known label, it's a gambling game is as good a label as any. So the way the game works is you essentially see two squares, and some people use doors, some people use squares. Doesn't really matter. Two cards, and one of them leads to rewards, and one of them doesn't. So one of them is better than the other one. Now it doesn't win all the time. So one of the doors might win 60% of the time, and the other door wins 10% of the time. So if you always pick the 10% door, you're only going to win 1 out of every 10 times. But if you pick the 60% door, you're going to win 6 out of 10 times. So we tell people those numbers, but they have to figure out which door is better. And so it's a form of gambling. When we do it in the lab, we actually pay people. So they're trying to earn money by picking the right door as much as possible. when we do it with the app, obviously we can't pay people, but we use points, and you're trying to get as many points as you can. Now, what's cool about that is what we do is we again looked at an evoked response, but we look at an evoked response for the feedback. So when you select a door, shortly afterwards, you're basically told whether you won or you lost. And if you win, there's a different evoked potential than when you lose. And that evoked potential is something called the reward positivity. So it's a really well-studied component, and one that I've spent a lot of time with because it's tied to human learning. But what's cool about that, and the reason we're building it into the next version of Aspire, is it's sensitive to depression. Yeah. So people that are depressed have lower reward positivity scores than people that aren't depressed. So Aspire will not only be able to tell you how tired you are, but it will also be able to do an assessment of whether, where you are on the depression scale.
Yeah, as a psychiatrist, when I hear you say that, I think of anhedonia, right? It's like these wonderful things happen to people, but they're depressed. They just don't even get excited about it because of the way that their brain is functioning. Is that kind of what we're looking at?
Yeah, so basically so if you dig into the reward positivity, it's basically brought about by a release of dopamine. So people that have issues with the dopamine system will have lower scores. So people that are depressed tend to have some issues with their dopamine system typically. But to be fair, if you had someone with Parkinson's disease play the game, they would have a lower score or a smaller reward positivity than someone without Parkinson's disease, because the underlying neurotransmitter is dopamine for that particular condition. And then, of course, you've got gambling addicts, right? Anyone that's got problems with the dopamine system, their scores will be biased. So we have to factor that in when we assess people.
That's amazing. So with the gambling, is it higher or is it just abnormal? Or
it depends on the underlying condition. Sometimes the reward response can be bigger than usual, and sometimes it's reduced. It depends on what. So with Parkinson's, depression, it tends to be smaller. Some other things like ADHD, it tends to be higher, actually.
So I feel like people have been looking for biomarkers for mental health disorders for a long time. I'm just thinking, what's your sort of scope on how this can be used, and will it be replicable? Is it now, because we have this mobile technology, that these things are going to become a lot more common because we have more data? Like, where does it come into that?
I personally think if you take the logical extension of Aspire, for instance, is you could imagine that you have a technology that you can deploy in households where people could self-assess. And you could imagine with mild cognitive impairment, for instance, what we're expecting is your scores should be relatively stable across time. But as you start to go down that slope, your scores should start to fall away. And we'll see those differences in the EEG signal long before anyone will notice behavioral differences. So you've got something that's a potential flag. So you could imagine people as they get older, they test themselves. And if the scores start to go down, that might be a reason to go see the doctor and start doing some follow-up. You could also imagine putting this technology into a doctor's office, and the tests that we do, like the oddball game takes about 5 minutes to play. The gambling game takes about 7 minutes. So you can imagine that part of your visit to the doctor's office every 6 months is you put on the headband and you play these games for 30 minutes, and then the doctor gets a readout of your brain health. And that's really where I see it going, is this complete assessment of brain health and brain function.
I was curious what you thought of, because like the traditional model of neurofeedback, right, is people go in and they get hooked up to a big system like the other one that you have in your lab. It's called ActiChamp, right?
That's correct.
They would get a quantitative EEG, just like a one snapshot before they start the training. But, I feel like my question is a little multifaceted, because I'm thinking about this, and they just get a one snapshot when they're in the room, rather than just like where you can use your tablet is what Aspire comes up on, and get more reading. So how do you think that will play into like I guess the neurofeedback industry?
Well, I think it'll become a part of it, right? I think that you'll have, you could imagine, just as you're going in to optimize your brain waves through neurofeedback training, part of it could be this kind of an assessment where, hey, well, here's all your brain scores.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I just think it's a logical extension of that. And you could imagine it just becomes a part of that process, which is if the brainwave optimization training is working, you'd expect some of these scores to go up. So, for instance, there should be some increase as you improve the brain function. So the evoked responses I'm talking about in a global sense, anything that improves your brain health will improve these scores.
I think
it's just a very objective way to measure it.
Right. I think what in my experience in working with people online doing neurofeedback training, the one component that I think people would like to see or are sort of craving is like a 3D mapping of like, here's this area of your brain and here's how it's functioning. And the ERP, right, is more of kind of a global quantitative assessment. But I wanted to ask you what you thought would be required to be able to do more EEG brain mapping in a quantitative sense in a mobile device.
It's going to come down to more electrodes. Mm-hmm. So if you made an extension of the Muse, imagine you had a headband that went the whole way around the head, and you had an electrode at every site. You'd get a little bit more specific in terms of the mapping. So when we use our big system, we've got 64 channels, so we can get very region specific. And also, if you do some very fancy mathematics, you can attempt to get what we'd call source analysis. So you can attempt to see what part of the brain the EEG or the ERP response is coming from. Some parts of the brain aren't visible just because they're too deep or due to the structure. So at the back of the head, for instance, you can't see the cerebellum with EEG because it's round and the electrical signals cancel out within the cerebellum. But you can get some sense of that. But with the mobile, I'm going to be proven wrong by some genius that figures this problem out. But currently, to the best of my knowledge, you can't really do that with just 4 or 5 electrodes. So, Muse can give you front, back, left, right kind of thing. But that's about as good as it will get. The other problem is that these EEG signals do propagate across the head. So just because you're measuring it here doesn't necessarily mean it's coming from right underneath that spot. It could be coming from somewhere else in the brain, but just due to the way the brain is built, that's just where you see it.
Yeah, and I think that, in any case, Aspire's is an amazing first step. It's really awesome. I wanted to ask you, as a neuroscientist, are there any technologies on the sort of horizon that you get really excited about that could really enhance your work even further?
Well, I think EEG has really made a huge comeback. EEG was big in the early days, and then people got excited about functional imaging. And I'd say functional imaging is on a bit of a downswing, so putting people in MRI scanners. And EEG is making a comeback, especially because it's so mobile. Probably one to keep an eye on is FNIRS. So it's Near-Infrared Spectroscopy. FNIRS, again, used to be big and expensive, but it's coming down in price quite a bit. It does a few things EEG can't, and just as there's things that EEG does that FNIRS can't. But at some point, these two things will be molded into the same headset, and you'll get data from both. So that's probably the one I'm most interested in. We've got a system in our lab, and we're getting some cool data off of it related to mental effort.
It's really awesome. Do you follow Mary Lou Jepsen and her talks?
I do indeed, yeah.
Yeah. I feel like I've been watching her like a hawk lately, just waiting to see what comes out of that lab she has in San Francisco. She talks some pretty spectacular things. We'll see if they come to fruition.
Oh, it's amazing what's happening right now. I've been working with a colleague of mine, Alona Feisch, and in her lab, they're taking the EEG while you read things, and they can decode which word you're looking at based on your EEG signal, which I didn't. They're taking some very fancy aspects of what I'd call computational neuroscience, so neural networks and machine learning and deep learning, and they're pulling some really cool things out of the EEG data, and it's just going to keep going that way. So there's so many people doing so many cool things out there.
How do you think the EEG and the infrared would converge? Any ideas there?
Complementary information. So if I default to my scientist position, more data is always better. So you're getting two different measures of the same phenomenon, because near-infrared spectroscopy is basically bouncing infrared, a laser beam essentially, off of the And what you're doing is you get different reflections depending on the amount of deoxy and oxyhemoglobin in the brain. And that data gets reinterpreted into some sort of signal. So what's cool about that is it tells you another bit about brain function. So, combining that with EEG is just going to get you a better picture of what's going on in there.
That's so awesome. I just wanted to wrap the conversation back around to meditation a little bit, since you are going to Nepal and talking with these Buddhist monks that have been just doing this for so many years. There's challenges in meditation research, right? In terms of like what type of meditation people are doing and where you get that data. And I'd love you just to hear your thoughts on that. Like, how is that going to be parsed out over time so that we can make our, neurofeedback for meditation technologies more effective and more custom?
Well, it's amazing because so for the record, I know a little bit about mindfulness and meditation, but it's definitely not my expertise. I know lots about EEG. When I first started diving into that literature, I was surprised at just how many studies have been done. And as you've indicated, the results differ quite a bit depending on style of meditation and expertise of the practitioner and any number of factors. But I think the more research that's done, the more the better picture we'll have of what's going on and what things influence the brain signals. Like there's some things that are pretty well known in terms of changes in alpha power and beta power, for instance. But it's one of these things that the more science we do, the better we'll understand it, and the more accurate, we'll be able to interpret that data and then apply it. But the Muse, for instance, does some cool things. Like there's no doubt that it when they use the mindfulness app that they have there, you're definitely in a mindful state, at least according to your EEG pattern. When it does seem to work. I've heard all these cool anecdotal accounts. The best one I heard was from a colleague at University of Washington, where they tested the Muse, where they got an expert meditator, someone that had been doing it their whole life, someone that sort of did it casually a couple times a week, and then someone that had never meditated. And in terms of the birds chirping, the expert was, had the positive sounds coming out, within seconds of putting the headband on. The person in the middle did pretty good, and the person that never meditated before struggled, but with practice got better, So there's definitely something there, and they've definitely captured at least one aspect of what's happening.
Yeah, and I think as much as people in the West are getting into meditation, I think that flow state for sports and business performance is probably even more on people's minds, at least in the regular work world. And I did read one of your papers that took a look at differences in beta and theta in terms of intuitive and analytical decision making. And I thought one of the things that was interesting about that is you did talk about how the data lined up with some studies, but not with others, and how that process was just evolving.
Yeah. What I find fascinating about it is when I got into this, I thought it was all solved. I was really naive. I thought, well, surely they know everything about the brain. We're learning so much every day. So that was, you're referring to work by my PhD student, one of my PhD students, Chad Williams. He's really interested in this what Daniel Kahneman calls system 1 or system 2 decision making. So analytical versus gut hunch. And he's had some pretty reliable results. We actually just replicated it with the Muse. We were able to get to classify decision state using a Muse headband. So the idea is that you see one pattern of neural activity when you're making an analytical decision, and you see a different pattern when you make an intuitive decision. But there's not, if there'd been thousands of studies, maybe we'd know the story a bit better, but there's not. There's a much smaller subset. So we're still trying to learn what factors do it, because not everyone uses the same task and not everyone's using the same participants. So there's a lot of factors that, make the results differ.
Yeah. But as we go along and just parse it little bit by little bit, understanding more and more, right, with the more data.
Well, that's how science works, like we all know about the big breakthroughs, like when Einstein wrote down E equals mc squared, but most science is done by a bunch of incremental things adding up to push us to the next big leap forward. So right now, a lot of these results are, getting stored away, and as we go through time, as a sum, they paint a very coherent picture.
Well, it's exciting to watch, and I'm so happy that there's people like you, good sir, doing the hard research so the rest of us can talk about it intelligently. And I really appreciate you coming on the channel here.
Oh, it's been fun. Thank you so much for having me.